The world held its breath in the summer of 1939. Only 2 decades had passed since the Great War ended, a conflict that was supposed to end all wars. But the silence across Europe was deceptive. It was not the silence of peace, but the quiet tension of a predator waiting to strike. In Berlin, the machinery of war was already turning. Adolf Hitler, having already annexed Austria and the Sudetenland, turned his gaze east toward Poland. The diplomatic letters sent between London, Paris, and Berlin were frantic, but they were merely paper shields against tanks of steel on the border of Germany and Poland. The air grew heavy. Ordinary farmers looked up from their fields to see convoys of trucks moving. Under the cover of twilight, the German Wehrmacht was assembling, a force unlike anything history had ever witnessed. This was not the trench warfare of the past, static and slow. This was something new. They called it Blitzkrieg lightning war. The strategy relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. While the world hoped for negotiation, the German High Command was finalizing coordinates for airstrikes. September 1 Street, 1939. 4:45 a.m. The darkness was shattered not by the sun, but by the roar of the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opening fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. Simultaneously, the Luftwaffe darkened the skies. Dive bombers, the infamous Stukas, screamed down from the clouds, their sirens designed to terrify civilians and soldiers alike before the bombs even landed. This psychological terror was a calculated part of the Nazi strategy across the border. Polish defenses were valiant, but tragically outmatched. They fought with bolt-action rifles and cavalry against panzer divisions that moved with relentless mechanical precision. The world watched in horror as the borders were erased in days. Britain and France, bound by treaties to protect Poland, issued an ultimatum to Germany: withdraw or face war. The deadline passed without a response. On September 3, the announcement came over the radio waves in London. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain spoke the words that confirmed everyone's worst fears. A state of war existed between Britain and Germany. The fragile peace was shattered. In the streets of Warsaw, civilians dug trenches and prepared for a siege, realizing they were the first victims of a new global catastrophe. The lights of Europe were going out, one by one, and a long, dark shadow was spreading across the continent. The Second World War had begun. With Poland conquered and divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, a strange and unsettling phenomenon took hold over Europe. For nearly 8 months, the great powers sat behind their fortifications, watching and waiting. The press called it the phony war, or in Germany, the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. French troops manned the Maginot Line, a colossal stretch of concrete bunkers and tunnels along the German border. Believing it to be impenetrable, they played cards, wrote letters home, and waited for an attack that did not come. The Allies deluded themselves into thinking that perhaps Hitler had been satisfied, or that an economic blockade would slowly strangle the Nazi war machine without further bloodshed. But, while the Allies waited, the Germans were refining the art of war. The silence was broken in April 1940, not on the Western Front, but in the North. German forces launched a lightning invasion of Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in mere hours. Norway fought longer, but was ultimately overwhelmed. The control of these northern territories secured vital iron ore supplies for German industry and provided naval bases to strike at British shipping. It was a wake-up call, but the true storm was yet to break. On May 10, 1940, the phony war ended abruptly. The German offensive in the West began with the ferocity that stunned the world. The Allies expected the main German attack to come through Belgium, just as it had in the First World War. Accordingly, the best British and French divisions rushed north to meet them. It was exactly what the German High Command wanted. It was a trap. While the Allies were distracted in Belgium, the main German armored thrust was moving secretly through the Ardennes forest in Luxembourg. The French generals had dismissed the Ardennes as impassable for tanks. They believed the dense trees and rough terrain were a natural barrier. They were wrong. 7 panzer divisions, stretching back nearly 100 miles, snaked through the narrow forest roads. When they emerged on the banks of the Meuse River near Sedan, the French defenders were paralyzed with shock. This was the sickle-cut plan, devised by General Erich von Manstein. The goal was not just to take territory, but to cut the Allied armies in half. General Erwin Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, pushed his tanks forward with such speed and disregard for supply lines that they became known as the Ghost Division. Even the German High Command couldn't track their exact location. They bypassed strongpoints, smashed through rear defenses, and raced toward the English Channel. The Allied front collapsed. Confusion reigned supreme. Communications lines were cut, and French commanders issued orders to units that had already been overrun hours before. The roads of France became clogged with millions of refugees fleeing south, mixing with retreating soldiers, creating a chaotic river of humanity that further hampered Allied movements. By late May 1940, the situation was catastrophic. The German sickle cut had worked with terrifying perfection. The British Expeditionary Force, along with thousands of French and Belgian soldiers, was pushed back to the sea. They were trapped in a shrinking pocket around the small port town of Dunkirk. With the German panzers only miles away, annihilation seemed inevitable. The British government began preparing the public for the worst, expecting to rescue, perhaps, 30,000 men before the harbor was overrun. Then, a strange pause occurred. On May 24, Hitler issued a halt order to his tank divisions, allowing the Luftwaffe to finish off the trapped armies from the air. This delay bought the Allies precious time. What followed was Operation Dynamo, one of the most extraordinary events of the war. From the coast of England, a call went out not just to the Navy, but to civilians. A flotilla of little ships set sail across the dangerous waters of the English Channel. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, lifeboats, and ferries braved German dive bombers and mines to pluck soldiers from the shallow waters. For days, the beaches of Dunkirk were a scene of organized chaos. Lines of soldiers stood chest deep in the water, waiting for salvation while Stuka bombers shrieked overhead, raining death upon the sand. Thick black smoke from burning oil refineries turned day into night. Yet, against all odds, the Mosquito Armada succeeded. Over 338,000 Allied soldiers were rescued. They left behind all their heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, and trucks littered the beach like iron skeletons, but the army itself survived to fight another day. However, for France, there would be no miracle. With the British gone and the French army shattered, the Germans turned south toward Paris. The resistance crumbled. To save the historic city from total destruction, the French government declared Paris an open city, meaning they would not defend it. On June 14, 1940, the unthinkable happened. German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. The swastika flag was hoisted atop the Eiffel Tower. The silence in the streets of Paris was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic thud of jackboots on the cobblestones. Parisians wept openly on the sidewalks as they watched their conquerors pass. Hitler demanded that the French surrender be signed in the exact same railway carriage in the Campigny Forest where Germany had surrendered in 1918 at the end of World War I. It was a calculated act of humiliation. On June 20 to end, the armistice was signed. France was divided, the North and West under German occupation, and a puppet state in the South known as Vichy France. Now, Britain stood alone. The United States was still neutral, and the Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Germany. Across the Channel, triumphant, German soldiers looked at the white cliffs of Dover through their binoculars, preparing for the invasion of England, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. In the summer of 1940, the fate of the free world hung on the wings of a few hundred fighter pilots. Adolf Hitler knew that to invade Britain, he first needed to destroy the Royal Air Force. He unleashed the Luftwaffe in a massive aerial campaign, expecting a quick victory. The German Messerschmitts were formidable machines, faster and heavily armed. But the British had two critical advantages: the Spitfire, a fighter plane of immense agility, and a secret weapon called radar. This new technology allowed the British to see enemy formations long before they crossed the coast, scrambling their squadrons to intercept just in time. Day after day, the skies over southern England became a chaotic canvas of contrails. Dogfights raged at 20,000 feet. Farmers in Kent watched as planes spiraled down, trailing smoke, crashing into fields that had been peaceful for centuries. The British pilots, many of them barely out of school, flew sortie after sortie. They would land, refuel, rearm, and take off again, fighting until they were physically collapsing from exhaustion. Prime Minister Winston Churchill immortalized their sacrifice with the words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Frustrated by the RAF's resilience, the Germans changed tactics in September. Instead of targeting airfields, they turned their sights on London. The Blitz had begun. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers pounded the capital. The wail of air raid sirens became the nightly soundtrack of the city. Londoners sought shelter in the underground stations, sleeping on the platforms deep beneath the earth, while the world above them burned. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The docks of the East End were engulfed in firestorms, so intense the heat could be felt across the river. But rather than breaking British morale, the bombing hardened it. The Blitz spirit emerged: a stubborn refusal to give in. Shop owners whose buildings were bombed out would simply set up a table on the sidewalk the next morning, with a sign that read, "Business as usual." The King and Queen remained in Buckingham Palace, visiting the bomb sites, walking among the ruins with the people. By October, it became clear to Hitler that air superiority could not be achieved. The RAF had not been destroyed. It was actually growing stronger. The invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely. Germany turned its eyes away from the stubborn island nation. Hitler's gaze shifted back to the east, towards his ultimate ideological enemy. He began planning the largest military invasion in history, a gamble that would ultimately decide the outcome of the war. Operation Barbarossa was being drafted, targeting the Soviet Union. By the spring of 1942, the Axis powers seemed invincible. The Nazi Empire stretched from the French coast to the deep interior of Russia, while Imperial Japan controlled vast swaths of the Pacific. But 1942 would prove to be the year the momentum finally shifted. The industrial giants of the Allied nations began to roar to life, and the first cracks in the Axis armor appeared. The first major blow came in the Pacific in June. The Japanese Navy, seeking to destroy the remnants of the American fleet, set a trap at the tiny atoll of Midway. But American codebreakers had deciphered their messages. They knew the attack was coming. When the Japanese fleet arrived, they didn't find helpless targets. They found an ambushing force. In a span of just 5 minutes, American dive bombers set 3 Japanese aircraft carriers ablaze, changing the course of the naval war instantly. A 4th carrier was hunted down later that day. Japan lost the core of its naval aviation strength and would never fully recover. The hunter had become the hunted. Meanwhile, in the scorching sands of North Africa, another duel was taking place. The British 8th Army, led by General Bernard Montgomery, faced off against the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, at El Alamein. For months, they had traded blows across the desert. But in October 1942, the British launched a massive artillery barrage that lit up the night sky like thunder. Overwhelmed by superior numbers and lacking fuel, Rommel's Afrika Korps was forced to retreat. It was the first major land victory for the British, prompting Churchill to famously declare, "Now this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." However, the most brutal turning point occurred. Deep in the Soviet Union, the German 6th Army had pushed into the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga River, Hitler became obsessed with taking the city that bore Stalin's name. What followed was a descent into hell. The battle devolved into Rattenkrieg, rat war. Soldiers fought room by room, cellar by cellar, and sewer by sewer. The city was reduced to a skeleton of concrete and steel, where snipers ruled the rubble. As winter set in, the Soviet Red Army launched a massive counter-encirclement, trapping nearly 300,000 German soldiers inside the ruined city, starving, freezing, and out of ammunition. The German commander, Friedrich Paulus, surrendered in February 1943 against Hitler's orders. The sight of thousands of German prisoners marching into captivity in the snow sent a shockwave through the Third Reich. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. For the first time, the Nazi war machine was not just stopped, it was being pushed back. The long, bloody road to Berlin had begun. By the middle of 1943, the perimeter of Hitler's fortress Europe was beginning to crumble. Following the victory in North Africa, the Allies looked north across the Mediterranean. Winston Churchill famously referred to Italy as the soft underbelly of the Axis, implying a quick and easy path into the heart of Europe. He was wrong. The invasion began in Sicily in July, followed by landings on the Italian mainland in September. The Italian government, tired of war and disaster, ousted Benito Mussolini, but the Germans quickly rushed in to occupy the country. What followed was not a swift march to victory, but a brutal, grinding slog up the mountainous spine of Italy. The soft underbelly turned out to be a tough gut. German defenders, masters of using terrain to their advantage, turned every ridge and river valley into a fortress. At Monte Cassino, an ancient monastery perched high atop a mountain, blocked the Allied advance to Rome for months. It became the scene of some of the fiercest fighting of the war, where soldiers from America, Britain, Poland, and India fought uphill against entrenched paratroopers in bitter winter conditions. Rome eventually fell in June 1944, but the campaign in Italy would remain a bloody stalemate until the very end of the war. While the infantry struggled in the mud of Italy, a different kind of war was being waged 5 miles above the earth. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had shifted into high gear. The strategy was simple but ruthless: round-the-clock bombing. The American 8th Air Force struck industrial targets by day, and the British RAF bomber command leveled cities by night. For the American aircrews flying the B-17 flying fortresses, every mission was a gamble with death. Flying through sub-zero temperatures in unpressurized cabins, they faced a gauntlet of flak, explosions, and swarms of German fighter planes. The losses were staggering. In 1943, bomber crewman had a statistically lower chance of surviving his tour of duty than a soldier in the trenches of World War I. But the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, a fighter plane capable of escorting the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, changed the equation. The Luftwaffe was forced into the air to defend their homeland and was systematically destroyed. By the spring of 1944, the Allies ruled the skies. Meanwhile, the British Isles had transformed into a massive armed camp. Southern England was so packed with tanks, trucks, artillery, and millions of American, British, and Canadian troops that locals joked the island would sink if the barrage balloons were cut loose. This was the buildup for Operation Overlord. To keep the Germans guessing, the Allies launched Operation Fortitude, an elaborate deception campaign involving fake inflatable tanks and phantom armies, commanded by General George Patton, designed to fool Hitler into thinking the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. The trap was set. The liberation of Europe was at hand. The waiting ended on the night of June 5, 1944. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, made the agonizing decision to launch the invasion despite marginal weather conditions. He told the troops, "The eyes of the world are upon you." Under the cover of darkness, thousands of paratroopers from the US 82nd and 101st Airborne and the British 6th Airborne divisions dropped behind enemy lines in Normandy. Their mission was chaos: secure bridges, destroy artillery, and disrupt the German response. Many were scattered miles off target, fighting alone, or in small groups in the pitch black hedgerows of France. As dawn broke on June 6, the horizon of the English Channel filled with the largest armada ever assembled, nearly 7,000 ships. The naval bombardment began, a thunderous overture that shook the earth. Then, the landing craft ramps dropped. At Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword Beaches, the Allies managed to get ashore with varying degrees of resistance. But at Omaha Beach, it was a slaughter. American troops walked directly into the kill zones of German machine guns perched on the cliffs. The water turned red. Men were cut down before they could even reach the sand. But through sheer grit and individual heroism, small groups of soldiers scaled the bluffs and silenced the guns. By nightfall, the Allies had a toehold in Europe. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The weeks that followed were a bloody stalemate in the bocage country, ancient hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress. But in late July, the Allies launched Operation Cobra, a massive breakout led by General Patton's Third Army. Once they punched through the German lines, the race was on. American tanks tore across the French countryside, liberating town after town. The German army in France collapsed, caught in a massive pocket at Falaise, where thousands were captured or killed. On August 25, 1944, the four-year nightmare ended for the City of Light. Free French forces and American troops entered Paris. The streets erupted in joy. Snipers still fired from rooftops, but nothing could stop the celebration. Women kissed soldiers, wine flowed freely, and the tricolor flag flew once again from the Arc de Triomphe. But the war was not over. As the Allies raced toward the German border, supply lines stretched thin. General Eisenhower faced a logistical nightmare: the Red Ball Express, a constant convoy of trucks, driven mostly by African-American soldiers, worked 24 hours a day to shuttle fuel to the thirsty tanks at the front. Optimism was high. Many believed the war would be over by Christmas, but the Germans were retreating to their own borders, and they were preparing a nasty surprise in the snowy forests of the Ardennes. The dying beast still had claws. In December 1944, the Allied advance stalled in the freezing forests of the Ardennes, on the border of Belgium and Germany. The mood was confident. Soldiers were looking forward to warm meals and Christmas letters. But in Berlin, Hitler was planning one final, desperate roll of the dice. He stripped the eastern front of his best remaining panzer divisions and hurled them at the thinly held American lines in the west. His goal was to split the British and American armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. On December 16, out of the heavy mist and snow, the German offensive struck. It was the Battle of the Bulge. Caught completely by surprise, American units were overrun or surrounded. In the town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was encircled, cut off from all support. When the German commander demanded their surrender, the American general, Anthony McAuliffe, sent back a one-word reply that became legendary: nuts. The paratroopers held the line in sub-zero temperatures, fighting off tanks with bazookas and sheer willpower until General Patton's Third Army, performing a miraculous 90-degree turn, broke through the snow to relieve them. The German offensive exhausted its fuel and manpower. It was the last gasp of the Wehrmacht in the West. By March 1945, the Allies reached the Rhine River, the last natural barrier to the heart of Germany. At Remagen, American troops found the Ludendorff Bridge incredibly still standing. They raced across it just minutes before German demolition charges were set to blow. The heartland of the Reich was now open. Meanwhile, from the east, the Soviet Red Army was an unstoppable tidal wave, fueled by vengeance for the millions of Russians killed. They smashed through Poland and crossed the Oder River. The German civilian population fled in terror. Berlin was now the target. In April, the Soviets encircled the German capital. The Battle of Berlin was apocalyptic. The city was reduced to a moonscape of rubble. Old men and young boys of the Hitler Youth were thrown into the fighting with Panzerfausts, ordered to die for a cause that was already lost. Deep In his bunker beneath the Chancellery, Adolf Hitler finally accepted the end. As Soviet troops fought their way to within blocks of his hideout, he committed suicide on April 30, 1945. His 1,000-year Reich had lasted only 12 terrifying years. On May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. May 8th was declared V-Day victory in Europe. Crowds in London, New York, and Paris danced in the streets. But the celebration was tempered by a grim reality. The war in Europe was over, but across the Pacific, the killing had not stopped. Japan was still fighting, and the invasion of their home islands promised a bloodbath unlike anything seen before. While the streets of Europe filled with confetti, the Pacific Ocean was still churning with blood. The war against Japan had evolved into a savage struggle of extermination. As American forces moved closer to the Japanese home islands, the resistance became more desperate. On the black sands of Iwo Jima and the muddy ridges of Okinawa, Japanese soldiers fought to the death. Hiding in caves and tunnels, surrender was considered shameful. At sea, the desperation took a terrifying new form, the kamikaze. Thousands of young Japanese pilots, flying planes loaded with explosives, turned themselves into human missiles, crashing directly into American warships. The message was clear: if the Allies wanted to invade Japan, they would have to pay for every inch with a mountain of corpses. Planners in Washington drafted Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. The casualty estimates were horrifying: up to 1 million American lives and tens of millions of Japanese. But in the deserts of New Mexico, a secret project offered a terrible alternative. Scientists of the Manhattan Project had successfully tested the world's first atomic bomb. President Harry Truman, facing the prospect of an endless slaughter, made the most controversial decision in military history. He ordered the weapon to be used. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a lone B-29 superfortress named the Enola Gay flew high over the city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., it released a single bomb, codenamed Little Boy. 43 seconds later, a blinding flash, brighter than 1,000 suns, erased the city. A mushroom cloud rose 60,000 feet into the air. In an instant, 70,000 people were vaporized. The heat was so intense that shadows of victims were burned permanently into the pavement. Stunned, the Japanese government debated surrender, but hesitated. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria, crushing their army in the east. The pincers had closed. Japan had no moves left. On August 15, 1945, the voice of Emperor Hirohito was heard on the radio for the first time by the Japanese public. In shaky, formal court language, he announced that the war had not developed to Japan's advantage. It was over. On September 2nd, aboard the battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese delegates signed the instrument of surrender under the gaze of General Douglas MacArthur. The guns finally fell silent. The Second World War was the deadliest conflict in human history, claiming over 70 million lives. It left Europe and Asia in ruins and birthed a new world order dominated by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. As soldiers returned home to rebuild their lives, the world looked back at the carnage with a solemn vow: never again. Humanity had survived its darkest hour, but the shadow of the atomic age had just begun to stretch across the future.